The first doctor lasted 9 minutes. The second didn't even make it to the bed. The third simply stood in the doorway and wept. Then he walked out of the house, down the muddy road, and was never seen in town again. What they saw in that room was something no man should ever witness, not in 1823, and not now. You've heard the name whispered, haven't you? Margaret, not Margaret the schoolteacher, not Margaret the seamstress or the town drunk's wife. This one, Margaret of Hollow Hill, was different. She didn't speak until she was 9. She didn't bleed until she was 17. And she didn't die when they buried her the first time. They thought they were dealing with madness. But this was older than madness. This was a breach. Let me take you back to the swamplands of Knox County, Ohio, in a year when the land itself seemed unsure whether to grow crops or swallow them whole. The fog didn't just roll in that spring, it clung. The sun rarely broke through, and when it did, it cast long, flickering shadows instead of light. Something was wrong. Everyone felt it. No one said it. There are stories buried in every town, but some don't stay buried. The Margaret case began, officially, on March 3rd, 1823. But if you ask the elders, the ones who drink in silence and flinch at thunder, they'll tell you the truth started far earlier, long before she was born, before the farmhouse, before the creek dried up and the neighbors stopped coming. They'll say it started in the soil, and they're right. That land was never meant for people. It belonged to the others, the ones without names, the ones whose bones lie in perfect spirals under the barn floor. Margaret's father was a preacher, not the kind who blessed fields and baptized babies. No, Elijah Gorel was the kind who saw the devil in every bird and the voice of God in every scream. He'd built their house with his own hands, 3 stories tall, windowless on the east side, the side that faced the hill. He had 4 children. Only Margaret survived past infancy, and even then, barely neighbors said she was strange from the start. Never cried, never smiled, just watched, stared, as if she was already waiting for something. By age 6, she was drawing symbols in the ash behind the stove. By 8, she stopped eating meat. By 10, animals wouldn't come near her. The dog jumped through a glass window to escape her touch. The goats screamed at night if she walked past their pens. But Elijah didn't stop preaching. He called it spiritual warfare, said Margaret had been marked, chosen by heaven or by hell, depending on his mood. Some Sundays he brought her to the pulpit, forced her to sit while he spoke in tongues no one had taught him. She never flinched, never blinked. She just sat, pale, still, too thin, too quiet, and stared at the back wall like it was whispering to her. By 1823, the town had had enough. Margaret was 17. Something about her changed. Not just the usual womanhood, no, something darker. Her eyes turned glassy, her voice deeper. People said she walked through storms without getting wet. Said her shadow didn't match her body. One boy claimed he saw her reflection move before she did. He left town 6 days later. No one knows where he went. Then came the screaming. It started in late February, from the Gorel house, just after midnight. Not Margaret's voice, not Elijah's, but something, else, something primal. It shook the shutters on neighboring farms. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Horses refused to go near the house. When the town elders finally sent someone to investigate, they chose Dr. Abel Merton, a Yale man, rational, logical, immune to superstition, he'd said. He entered the house at 8:02 a.m. By 8:11, he ran out the front door without his bag, coat, or hat. His skin was covered in scratches, not like from a person, but like someone had dragged him through brambles inside a bedroom. He didn't say a word, just walked straight out of town. He died of fever 3 weeks later in Marietta. On his deathbed, he wrote 6 words to his sister. "Don't open her mouth, it's watching." A second doctor tried the next day. He vomited before he even reached the second floor. The third, Dr. Reuben Clark, was different. A war surgeon had seen men gutted, shot, even burned. He thought it was just hysteria. Perhaps some reclusive epileptic episode brought on by grief and poverty. He stepped into Margaret's room at 7:47 p.m., and he stood still for 14 minutes. He didn't examine her. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He turned, walked out, sat on the front porch for an hour, hands trembling. Then he arose, left his instruments on the ground, and began walking west. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone. All 3 doctors recorded the same detail in their hastily scribbled notes. Her mouth didn't open, but something behind her teeth was breathing. Margaret didn't speak for weeks after that, just sat in bed, rocking, whispering. Syllables no one recognized. Her father locked the room, refused to let anyone else in. The church excommunicated him. His neighbors cursed his name. But it wasn't until they dug beneath the house that they found it 30-7 FEMURS. No skulls, no spines, just femurs, all child-sized, stacked like firewood in a perfect ring beneath Margaret's room. And in the center of that ring, a doll. Not a child's doll, a binding doll. The kind used by tribes no one dares name out loud anymore. Sewn with skin, eyes carved from bone. Its mouth was open, and inside was something black, slick, and moving. I'll pause here, because if you're still watching, if you're still breathing normally, you don't yet understand what this story really is. This isn't about Margaret. It never was. She was the gate, not the monster. You'll understand that soon. But before we go further, I need you to do something. Something symbolic. Something binding. Comment below, "I saw her teeth." Yes, twice. Write it twice. It's not for the algorithm. It's to mark the moment you chose to wake up. Because after this point, there's no turning back. Now, let's go deeper. A girl cannot carry that much silence unless something is carrying it for her. Margaret didn't eat after the doctors left. Not bread, not water, not even broth from the widow Elsby, who insisted on bringing soup every morning until she heard what Margaret had whispered through the door. "It already knows your name." By the second week of March, she hadn't spoken a full sentence, hadn't left the bed, hadn't blinked while anyone was watching. Yet her fingernails grew, her hair thickened, and there were scratch marks under her bed, deep ones, as if someone, or something, had been trying to dig its way out. The sheriff ordered Elijah Gorell to surrender the girl to the church tribunal for investigation of unnatural influence. It wasn't an arrest. It was a religious seizure, a quiet one, the way old churches used to do things, with ritual, not rope. The tribunal was held in the abandoned stone chapel at the edge of Knox Hollow, the one the settlers had built in 1792 and boarded up 20 years later. When the forest started taking back the graves, they lit 33 candles around her, each blessed with oil and inscribed with the names of minor saints. The air smelled of ash and mold. The tribunal included Reverend Jonas Bell, 2 elders, a scribe, and 1 man whose name was never written. Just described, as the dark-suited one. He didn't speak. He just watched. Margaret was brought in by two handlers. She didn't resist, but her body was stiff, heavy, like it was trying to root itself into the earth. Her eyes were wide, open, black. Not dilated, but black. No iris, no sclera, just black dot. When they sat her in the circle of candles, she laughed, not a child's laugh, not even a woman's. It was the kind of sound that shouldn't come from a human throat, like stone breaking under water. Reverend Bell asked her name. She didn't answer. He asked what was speaking through her. She smiled then, in perfect Sanskrit. She replied, "What was buried in the blood of the firstborn cannot be removed by prayer." The scribe dropped his pen. The dark-suited man stood, and outside, though no wind was blowing, the chapel door slammed shut. The elders asked how. She learned Sanskrit. The girl who had never attended school, who could barely write her own name, she answered in Greek, then Hebrew, then a language no one in the room recognized. One of the candles flickered. Another went out. Then another, when only 12 remained. Lit, Margaret turned her head for the first time in an hour and said this: "The doctrine of the body is incomplete. You protect the mind, you bless the soul, but you forget the body is the doorway. Every door can be forced open if you know where the hinges are." Reverend Bell stood, shaking. "Who are you?" Margaret's mouth opened, and every candle went out at once. They heard bones crack in the darkness. They heard the wet sound of something crawling across stone. The scribe screamed and fled. One elder began vomiting uncontrollably. The second dropped to his knees, whispering the Psalms in reverse. And when the dark-suited man finally lit a match, Margaret was back in her chair, smiling. But one of the elders was gone. All that remained was his tongue, nailed to the chapel floor with a rusty nail that hadn't been there minutes before. No one spoke of that night again. Not in church, not in court. The official records said the elder died of a stroke in service. But if you dig deep enough, you'll find the real notes, hidden inside a locked drawer in the archives of the First Church of Mount Vernon. One page, 6 words: "She cannot be moved. She watches." They returned Margaret to the farmhouse, but she didn't go alone, because after that night, the birds left the valley, the dogs stopped barking, the weather turned, and the shadows, they began to bend. Now, let's pull back the veil. What was Margaret really? Possession? Madness? Some rare disease? No. This was the return of a pattern. A forgotten technology of control. You see, the church once knew what the body could do, not as a vessel, but as a conduit, a mechanism, a gate. Certain bloodlines, certain frequencies, certain geographies. These things opened doorways. Margaret's mother, never listed in the county registry. Her birth, no midwife, no record, no grave. But if you examine the Goral family Bible, the one stored in the locked cabinet at the Ohio Historical Society, you'll find something written in the back, in faded ink. She came from the river at night. We never heard her cry. She wasn't born. She was delivered, and she wasn't alone. The ancient tribes spoke of them, watchers in female form, planted in bloodline families, activated by ritual, triggered by proximity to forgotten ground. They weren't witches. They weren't demons. They were mechanisms. And when society forgets the cost of forgetting, the mechanisms wake up. That's why the doctors fled. That's why the tribunal failed. That's why the land hasn't healed. Because Margaret was never just a girl. She was the answer to a question no one should have asked. And now that you're here, you're beginning to ask it too. It wasn't the blood that disturbed the archivist. It was the handwriting, because it was his own, and he hadn't written it yet. There's a vault beneath the old courthouse of Mount Vernon, sealed in 1812 with 7 iron bolts and a portlead, plate stamped with the seal of Governor Return, Jonathan Meigs. Inside that vault are records, hand-bound ledgers, journals, and private correspondences recovered from the early colonial missionary expeditions. The vault was never supposed to be reopened, not because of its age, because of what it contains. The name Margaret Gorel appears there, but not in 1823. It appears in 1794, nearly 30 years before she was supposedly born. The entry is brief, but haunting. Marked child found near River Bend. No umbilicus, no pulse, yet eyes open. Screams without breath. Secured under chapel stones. Entry number 47. Mission report. Father Samuel Beck. Oct. 1794. Now ask yourself, if that child was entombed in 1794, under the chapel, how was she walking around alive in 1823? Unless she never left, unless someone unsealed her, and that someone was her father. Elijah Gorel wasn't born in Knox County. He came from Vinton Township, from an Alvinished sect known as the Disciples of the Sign, a fringe offshoot of the Puritan revivalists, who believed that heaven was mechanical, and that divine resurrection could be engineered with the proper sacrificial architecture. They believed in resonance, in spatial incantation, in embedding sacred codes into buildings, floorboards, and even WOMBS. And they taught that a girl born without breath is a girl born for the gate. So what did Elijah really build in 1805? Not just a farmhouse. He built a resonance chamber, aligned with the hill, the old native burial line, and the flow of the creek, which, by the way, runs upstream on certain nights in spring. That was no accident. The settlers knew, they just chose to forget. But memory, like water, finds a way. Back, let me tell you about the archivist. His name was Warren Teague, and in 1947, he was tasked with cataloguing the pre-statehood ledgers found in the courthouse basement. Most were brittle, unreadable, but one book, bound in calfskin, held shut with a brass clasp, bore a symbol that didn't match any. Religious order on file, a 7-toothed jaw, ink stamped into the leather, not drawn. Branded. Warren broke the clasp at 3:14 p.m. on a Wednesday. By 3:18, he had begun screaming, not loud, not frantic, just endless. A continuous exhale, as if his lungs had been hollowed out and filled with whatever was inside that book. When the custodian found him 12 minutes later, Warren was unresponsive. His mouth was open, his eyes rolled back, and he was still screaming. But here's what the report omits. Warren's notepad, which he always carried in his vest pocket, contained 3 pages of notes. Scrawled in red pencil, backwards, were these words: Margaret was the first seal. But there are others, 3 in Ohio, 2 in West Virginia, 1 beneath the Potomac, and 1 still waiting to be named. He died 2 days later in a sanatorium. In Zanesville, his throat was swollen shut, but not from injury, not from illness. It was as if something inside him had grown tired of waiting, and finally sealed him from the inside out. That was 19 for 7. In 1953, the book disappeared. So did the brass clasp. So did the archivist's notes. Except one, a torn corner, stuffed between 2 pages of an unrelated ledger, the marriage log of New Harmony settlers. The ink was faded, but it said this: "Don't ask who Margaret was. Ask what opened the night she came back." Let's stop here for a moment and breathe, because if you're starting to feel it, the cold behind your ribs, the tightness in your chest, the voice that's been reading with you, not to you, you're not crazy, you're just beginning to hear the resonance. Margaret was never just a possession, never just a victim. She was a calibrated event, a breach. Something was testing this land, this system, our minds. But the horror wasn't in the supernatural, it was in the men who knew and said nothing. The first ledger entry describing Margaret isn't even the oldest. There's another, dated August 13th, 1749, written by a French Jesuit missionary named Pierre Dumont. The girl in white walks the bend again. No breath, no voice, but the birds do not sing when she passes. She watches the chapel door as if it owes her something. Now tell me, how does a girl with no breath keep walking for 74 years? She doesn't, not unless something else is using her. And I'll give you a word. One you've never seen in any school book or sermon. For Millen, it's written 6 times across that ledger. No definition, just the word. Each time beside dates where people disappeared, rivers reversed, and would refuse to burn. I asked a Sumerian linguist once. He'd never seen it before, but he paused when he read it aloud. He said it sounded like a contraction of 2 Akkadian roots, Foma, Lin. He translated it, hesitantly, as the thing that wears the girl. So, I'll ask you now, was Margaret a child? Or was she the first vessel in a long chain of forgotten breaches? And if so, how many others walk among us, mouths closed, waiting for their hinge to be found? Because they don't scream when they wake, they hum, and if you've ever heard that sound at night in an old house, in a place where the past feels heavy, in the stillness when the air goes dead, you already know what it means. With bricks. They used something that bled when struck, and even now, when the rains come, it still hums. There's a hill 2 miles west of where Margaret was found. Locals call it Hollow Hill, but no modern map lists it. Not anymore. It once connected Danvers Township to the lower freight line into Mount Vernon, and underneath it runs a tunnel 880 feet long, carved between 1850 and 1852, then sealed 2 weeks after the Gorel case was declared closed. Officially, the tunnel was condemned due to flooding. Unofficially, it wasn't water that made them seal it. It was the screaming. Not from within, from beneath. Let's back up. After Margaret was taken from her home, she was housed for 9 nights at the Our Lady of Vigilance convent, under constant watch. But on the 10th night, she vanished from her bed, with no broken window, no footprints, no sign of struggle. What they found, 13 hours later, was her bare footprint. In the deepest part of the Hollow Hill tunnel, it was pressed into dry stone, but the rock itself was slightly warped, as if softened by heat or pressure, not of this earth. Beside it, burned into the wall, were 3 vertical marks, parallel 6 inches apart, and a ring of bone fragments, arranged clockwise, with a gap due north. The local priest called it a desecration site, but a retired geologist named Eli Makaroth disagreed. He called it a siren's seal. Eli claimed he'd seen one just like it before during the dig in 1938 at Chaco Canyon, where an identical pattern was found beneath an unmarked kiva. Only difference: that pattern had been sealed with resin and children's teeth. The ring was meant to keep something in, but once Margaret stepped inside it, it woke up. And it's what happened next that no one talks about, because on the following day, April 2nd, 1823, the original township records of Danvers were set to be transferred to Mount Vernon. Names, census, tax ledgers, land ownership, they never arrived. The wagon carrying them was found overturned on the northern creek bed, wheels shattered. The driver, Thomas Mill, was missing, but in his place was a girl. Not Margaret, another one, face down, mouth sewn shut with thorns. No heartbeat, but warm, the attending constable wrote. There was no blood, not hers, not anywhere. Just the smell, copper, rot, and something like ozone after a lightning strike. She looked like Margaret, but her face was slightly off, like it had been made from memory, an unfinished mask. Now we must ask, why were the township records of Danvers destroyed? And what happened to the village itself? Because according to the 1855 Ohio Infrastructure Recalibration Act, Danvers was declassified as a recognized habitation due to persistent subsoil instability and geographic non-compliance. But those are bureaucratic lies, because Danvers still existed on maps as late as 1922, a thriving township of 212 people, and then gone, erased. Homes collapsed, roads buried, church bells found melted into the ground. But one thing remained, the tunnel, and in 1931, railway inspectors sent to examine Hollow Hill for potential reopening filed an anonymous report, now redacted, that included the following. The wall is not brick, it's not stone. We struck it and it groaned. There's something behind it. Alive or not, I cannot say, but I will not return. They sealed the tunnel not with mortar, but with compressed bonecrete, a military-grade, ossified compound made from pulverized calcium, blood paste, and resin. There are only 4 known cases of its use in American history, each time to contain something, and Hollow Hill was the first. But here's where it goes deeper. There was a boy in Danvers. His name was William Rook. He was 11 in his final journal entry. Recovered from a buried footlocker in 1992, he wrote this. Father said not to play near the hill, but I heard her again. She was crying without crying. She said her name wasn't Margaret. Said Margaret was the skin she wore to come through. Said the others are coming too. From the white river below. I saw her eyes. They weren't sad. They were old. She didn't blink. William Rook disappeared the next night. His body was never found. But in 1965, a group of geology students discovered a human jawbone lodged between 2 stones deep in the tunnel wall, fused into the structure like it had grown there. It was small, child-sized, with 1 molar wrapped in iron wire, a folk ritual used by some Appalachian cults to bind spirits inside teeth. And the worst part, the jawbone was still warm to the touch. Now ask yourself, why has no historian written of Danvers? Why are there no gravestones, no churches, no census remnants? Because Danvers wasn't erased by time. It was sacrificed. Used to build something Margaret opened. Something deeper than language. Something old enough to understand our silence. And if Margaret was its first vessel, Danvers was its first toll. Because once you unseal the resonance, once that hum begins, something must answer. And once it's answered, it remembers. So I'll leave you with this. There is a tone inaudible to the human ear, still emitted from Hollow Hill, measured in 1999 by EMF scanners. It pulses every 61 minutes exactly, a low, rhythmic vibration that affects blood pressure, short-term memory, and compass rotation. They say the tunnel is closed, but if you go at night and place your hand on the wall, you'll feel it, like breath, from the other side, waiting. Time does not move. We move through its shape. 52 years before Margaret's birth, a woman named Temperance Blackwood was accused of temporal blasphemy by the Church of Saint Restraint, a now defunct Protestant sect in southern Ohio. Her crime: she claimed to have seen a girl in visions, a girl not yet born. Her journal survives, hidden in the prohibited archives of the Cuyahoga Institute. Entry number 131B. She wears white, but not for mourning. Her hands are soil, her mouth closed by man but opened by the thing below. Her name they call Margaret, but that is not what she is. Her true name cannot be said by the living. This was written before Ohio was a state, before Margaret's family even arrived from the Carolinas. Temperance Blackwood was blind. She never married. She spent her final 6 years in isolation on Grief Hill, in a one-room hut made of mosswood and prayer rock. She died in 1777, buried by 2 men who refused to speak of what they saw in her cabin. The coroner's report lists no visible injuries, yet her jawbone was missing, and the inside of her skull was scorched, as if lit from within. No fire, no trauma, just heat, internal, directed. Here's where it gets worse. Inside the walls of her cabin, carved in reverse so they could only be read by candlelight reflection, were dozens of names. Names of towns, churches, hills. But one name appears 7 times. Margaret, and beneath it, a phrase repeated in Latin: Quae non nata est, eum venit. She who is not born has already come. This is not prophecy. This is memory, misplaced, because Blackwood was not the only one. In 1803, a census entry was recorded in Knox County, listing the residents of a household under Elijah Gore. It lists Elijah 45, Hannah wife 39, Samuel's son 12, Margaret age listed twice, 0 and 34. No explanation, no correction. In fact, the census taker left a note beside the name. She answered the door, but the child was also in the crib. Same eyes, same scar on the left hand. No birthmark on one, but a voice in both. That document was pulled from public view in 1972 by the Ohio Office of Historical Rectification. Why? Because time isn't moving. We Are Margaret is not a person. She is a convergence, a fixed point around which the past folds and the present misfires. That's why the priest said she had no shadow on certain days. That's why Dr. Frayne insisted her blood had double sediment, layers as if 2 lives had been lived at once, and the church floor. Let's go back to that. After the Danvers church burned in 1824, only one thing remained: the floorboards. Every wall incinerated, the bell melted, pews turned to ash, but the floor, untouched, carved into it, now visible due to the scorched soot, was a spiral of 88 names. The last name, again, Margaret, only this time it was written backwards, with the letter G turned to resemble a reversed sigma, a symbol seen only once before, in the ritual diagrams from the satyr cult of southern Italy, known for their obsession with the unmoved mover and reverse incarnations, souls, born before the bodies they are meant to wear. These cults believed certain souls do not descend in time. They pull time into them, reshape it, fold it. They believed these souls were gates. Now listen to this. In 1911, during the excavation of a collapsed well near Mount Vernon, researchers discovered a copper box wrapped in rawhide, buried 41 feet. Below the surface, inside, a single page. On it, the following text: "The girl is not the girl. She is the song remembered by the mouth before the lungs formed. She is the mother of the wound that will one day create her." It was signed Temperance. Blackwood, now you ask, how? How could a woman in 1771 describe a girl not born for 52 years? Because what we call time is just a convenience, a safety net against the raw force of recurrence. Margaret is not an accident. She is ritual made flesh. She is not possessed. She is the thing we've been trying to possess and failing. The doctrine was always wrong. It's not the soul you must guard. It's not the mind you must purify. It's the body, because the body is the door. And Margaret, she never closed. It not because she wouldn't, but because it was never hers to close. You cannot bury a key and expect the door to vanish. It happened on the third moon. The townspeople had no other choice. They'd tried medicine, scripture, exorcism. They had sealed her room with 6 rings of salt. They had driven blessed nails into the corners of her bed. But the dreams kept spreading. Not hers, theirs. Every child under 12 woke, screaming at exactly 3:07 a.m. every night. For 6 nights, each screamed the same word: below. Farmers reported finding tongue-shaped stones buried in their fields. The river began to run upstream, but only on Sundays. One widow claimed her late husband knocked at her door, mouth sewn shut, eyes replaced with wooden buttons, and asked if Margaret still remembered the song beneath the stairwell. They had to end it, and so, in the pre-dawn hours of June 3rd, 1823, 10 men from the valley, all Freemasons, all sworn never to speak of that night, took Margaret from her bed, still silent, still smiling, and carried her to Coven's Hollow. A shallow grave had already been dug, 6 feet long, 4 feet deep, lined with iron shavings, chicken blood, and pages from the Book of Job burned at the edges. They didn't use rope. They didn't bind her hands. They simply placed her in the grave, covered her body in linen, and began to bury her. She never fought, never screamed, just stared straight up, until the 3rd shovelful. That's when her mouth opened, and she said, "I was already here when you were born." The wind died. The trees froze. And one of the men, a blacksmith named Harland, Poe, fell backward into the dirt, eyes wide, whispering a single phrase over and over. Her voice was behind me. They finished the burial. Then they ran, but that wasn't the end, because 3 days later, the grave was empty, not disturbed, not dug out, just clean, no soil displaced, no broken earth, no tracks, just a handprint made in ash on the inside of one of the grave walls on the rock itself. The print had 6 fingers, and one of them was backwards. That same night, a boy named Eli Vance, 11 years old, deaf since birth, walked barefoot into the town square and recited in flawless Hebrew, "The girl is not gone. The earth is her breath. Every buried thing bends toward her mouth." Then he collapsed, died on the spot. No explanation, no autopsy, just a stone placed over his heart and a single instruction given by the undertaker: do not let her near the body. But no one knew where she was until the 3rd full moon. That's when the Hartwell Mill shut down. Every cog, every gear, frozen solid. 3 workers vanished. 2 were later found in the grain chute, folded wrong, their jaws torn off, and placed gently in their open palms. The third man's fate is still officially unsolved. But unofficially, his bones were found inside a river boulder 5 miles downstream, not near it, inside it, as if the stone had grown round him. When the coroner cracked it open, they found something even stranger, a second jawbone, matching Margaret's. But how? Was she buried, or was she never there at all? The only person who seemed to know was old Reverend Bell, the one who'd seen her speak languages he couldn't name. He locked himself in the old bell tower for 7 nights and wrote nothing but a single line over and over. The body is not a vessel, it is the ritual. And that is where our mistake begins. You see, we always believed the body was a container for soul, for mind, for memory. But what if the body was never meant to hold anything? What if the body is a spell, a formula? Margaret wasn't corrupted. She wasn't possessed. She was activated. And the burial wasn't her failure. It was the final step of a ritual. None of them understood. A resurrection, not of flesh, but of architecture. Because 3 weeks later, the layout of the town began to shift. The roads rerouted themselves. Church doors no longer faced east. The wind blew from the center of town outward, and every compass spun in silence. Maps no longer matched the land. Margaret had returned, but she was underneath, inside, not walking the streets, but watching through them. And one by one, those who had buried her began to vanish, each with a perfect ash handprint left on their front door. So when they say this was just folklore, when they call it hysteria, or label it a forgotten hoax, remember this. In 1963, a contractor digging beneath the old Gorell farmhouse found a jawbone with 6 teeth, baby teeth, still forming. It was tested 3 times. The results? Not human, not animal, but the same calcium composition as a river stone, and etched into the underside of the bone. So small you'd need a microscope to read it. She watches from below. History isn't written by the victors. It's written by the survivors trying to forget. In the fall of 1972, an archivist named Ronald Hespeler was tasked with transferring fragile historical documents from Knox County's sealed vaults into microfilm. During this process, he found Box 117B, no barcode, no index, stamped only with a phrase, "Do not remember her." Inside was a short reel of 16mm film, no title card, no credits, just 8 minutes of flickering footage. What it shows is not confirmed by any public source, but here is what Ronald Hespeler's daughter, who claims to have watched it once before. Her father was committed, wrote in her private memoir, "A girl in white, walking backward into a barn. Her face never changes, but the background does. The seasons flicker, the sky bends. At minute 3:12, the camera tilts. Dozens of children stand silently around a well. No one moves. But their reflections in the water look directly at the viewer. By 1973, the original reel was destroyed. Officially, accidental fire. Unofficially, black bag operation tied to Operation Montecore, a joint venture between the Department of Defense, the CIA, and a now defunct civilian research group called the Temporal Cohesion Project. Why? Because of what happened in Room 14. At the Edgewood Arsenal, Edgewood, Maryland, July 11th, 1971, Project Covenant, a classified attempt to test precognitive capabilities in children born with abnormal IG patterns. One subject, referred to only as MK11, was a 12-year-old girl who'd never spoken. She had one feature considered medically impossible: 2 different sets of fingerprints, one on each hand. In test number 23, MK11 was shown a series of historical photographs, one of which was a faded 19th century church floor plan, recovered from Ohio. She began to hum, low, dissonant, then placed her hand on the photo and whispered, "She is still inside." Researchers assumed she meant the church, but when they checked the room's wall-mounted camera feed, something had changed. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed a second shadow behind MK11 that did not move with her, a reflection in the glass that showed a woman in white, but only from the waist down, a flicker, just one of a handprint on the one-way mirror, upside down. In Ashdod, the program was shut down that same night. All records were sealed until 2009, when a Freedom of Information Act request unearthed Project Covenant's internal notes. What name appeared? Margaret. Twice. Once in a reference to the Margaret effect, a term used to describe information anomalies that occur around female subjects under deep trance, and again in the list of banned stimuli. No images of wells, no mentions of the Danvers fire, no utterance of the name Margaret in any form. Use control term, sig. Instead, still think this is just a legend. Then explain what happened in 2017, when amateur cryptographers found an encoded message buried in a broken GPS module retrieved from an abandoned military test balloon found near Mount Vernon. The decrypted line, "She does not need to walk the land. The land remembers her." When the balloon's origin was traced, it led to a private defense contractor, now dissolved Statera Dynamics, which operated out of a sealed compound 5 miles west of the old Hartwell Mill. Guess what they were? Researching geopsychological resonance. Specifically, how emotions, memories, and ritual trauma can imprint onto geography, essentially hauntings at scale. Their conclusion: that certain places aren't haunted. They are built around a trauma that thinks, a trauma that organizes, a trauma that remembers itself. They called this effect Type M recurrence. The M was never explained, but now you know. The final surviving researcher from Statera Dynamics, an engineer named Alan Rives, was interviewed anonymously in 2020. He said this: "Margaret is not a girl. She is not a ghost. She is not a curse. She is a reminder, a boundary condition written in skin. She appears when we forget what was done to her, and more importantly, what she was made to do." Reeves died 3 months later in a car accident that left no tire marks, no impact damage, and no evidence of collision. Just an upside-down handprint scorched into the driver's seat. The truth wasn't buried. The case is still open. It was waiting to be remembered. So where is she now? The year was 2019. A sinkhole opened beneath the long-abandoned Hartwell grain mill, swallowing 3 tons of equipment and rupturing a survey team's drill line. The official report labeled it a geological instability due to historic riverbed erosion. But the raw footage from drone Unit B9, which never aired publicly, showed otherwise at 72 feet below ground. Beneath layers of compacted rock and limestone was a chamber, perfectly circular, sealed in concrete, and marked with a single phrase in iron lettering for her silence. They sent in a tethered bot. What it found has never been formally acknowledged, but leaked screenshots and survivor interviews suggest the following. The chamber's interior was not carved, it was grown. The walls weren't concrete. They were bone-like in density, with organic striations, like growth rings in a tree in the center. A well, or rather, what was once a well, now sealed shut with a black slab of river stone, etched into the slab, barely visible without UV light. This is not where she sleeps. This is where we tried to forget her name. The name Margaret appeared nowhere, but a symbol, 6 intersecting crescents forming a closed spiral, was found burned into the ceiling. And then came the sound, not loud, not constant, but timed. Every 77 seconds, a low-frequency pulse, infrasonic, subaudible, but it made the teeth vibrate. Engineers reported nausea, dizziness. One vomited blood. Another began to speak in reverse, saying things like, "She's not waiting, she's..." Remembering, the town was never built over her. It was built by her. They pulled the team. Concrete was poured. 6 tons. Reinforced with ash, blessed salt. Crushed iron nails. They said it was sealed. They said it was over. But 2 weeks later, a child was born in nearby New Haven, a girl. What made her birth unusual was not the time, not the place, but what the attending physician reported. She was born without a shadow. Even under direct light, nothing appeared. And her first word spoken not at 2 years old, not 1, but at 6 days, was this, "Well." Doctors dismissed it as nonsense. But when they ran a thermal scan of the infant's body, they discovered a faint spiral in the tissue density of her spine, exactly 6 crescents. Nested dot, just like the ceiling of the chamber. We buried Margaret in 1823. We buried her again in 1972. And we buried her for the final time in 2019. But she does not stay. Buried because Margaret was never a girl. Not in the way we think. She was a pattern, a recurrence, a warning carved into time itself, a reminder of what happens when we take a voice, a child, a sacrifice, and try to hide it under history. We called it hysteria. We called it mass delusion. We called it possession. But what if Margaret wasn't possessed? What if she was the possessor? Not of people, but of space, of structure, of memory, because some trauma doesn't haunt us. It builds us. It waits, quietly, in our architecture, our blueprints, our sidewalks, and street grids. And when we forget, it speaks asterisk. Her story was never about horror. It was about what happens when we bury the truth in the name of order, and the earth itself remembers what we refuse to